segue to the feasibility study.
Well, that is.
Isn't it?
Is it? I don't know.
I know. She tried.
How was that? Yeah.
Oh, no, well, it's about school planning, long-range planning, where resources go, how students move, how we look at equity through who's in our schools and where they are and how they get there, right?
Do you know if the streaming service is working yet?
I don't believe streaming is where it'll be posted afterwards, but it's not.
I'm
It's-
just thinking that maybe we should announce who we are if all they can do is hear us.
Well, there's no streaming at
Oh,
all.
there's no streaming at all.
Right, but we still should announce who we are so that way closed captioning knows.
Okay.
No one can see us now, but in the future, it'll be posted. Yes, we have some infrastructure needs that may be changing the next budget. Yes, yes. So if you'd like to, I think it'd be helpful to have, for the people who are watching in the future, since they can't be watching now, but I'm Christiane Rigby, District 3 County Councilwoman and current chair. So to have a brief overview about the feasibility study, what's different this time around than last time around, and sort of how we can all work together.
So, good morning once again. So for introducing ourselves, I'm Dr. Martirano, the superintendent of schools. We have a number of individuals around the table to address conversations about this. But I think the most significant piece is that our board, relatively new, has 4 new board members. On January 24th, unanimously passed a motion to direct myself and the school system to begin the boundary adjustment process and to look at our capacity issues of where we are. We have spent an incredible amount of time in our planning efforts. We're meeting with our elected officials individually, collectively, in our communities, and we have several summary documents in here. I'm going to ask our Chief Operating Officer, Vanessa Brown-Dennis, to go through some of that. We have other individuals ask specific questions, but we will wrap up quickly and then allow you to ask the questions of which you need and are on your mind.
Okay, thank you. Anissa Brown-Dennis, Chief Operating Officer, and also around the table, Scott Washington. He is the Director of Capital Planning and Construction, and Tim Rogers is the Planning Analyst from School Planning. So some things that are a little differently, that are going a little differently this year would be the fact that we have a communication plan that the Office of Communication has developed. So they're working alongside of Office of School Planning to assist with the communication plan. As Dr. Martirano just shared, we are meeting with elected officials, with board members, and small groups just to make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of the communication plan. I guess in terms of a summary of the feasibility, Mr. Rogers can go through some of the options, and that's exactly what they are. So we want to be clear that he is outlining options. It's not the end-all, be-all. It's not the final recommendation. They are options, and there are about 10 options for the community to read, look at, and there are many different forums for questions and to provide feedback. And so I guess at this time I'd like to turn it over to Tim, unless Mr. Washington has anything else to add before I turn it over to Tim to review some of the options in terms of the summary of the feasibility study.
Well, good morning, Scott Washington, Director of Capital Planning and Construction. I think the only other 2 things I would add, and I know Ms. Brown-Dennis talked about the fact that we've had a little bit more communication this year with our communication team and plan, is the fact that we have started our AAC meetings and the fact that we are using a consultant.
And explain AAC, Attendance Area Committee.
You have that, yeah, exactly. I want to emphasize the consultant piece, the fact that our cooperative strategies, our consultant that's actually working with us on that process, they are working with us in basically in terms of going through the meetings, facilitating the meetings, working with our team on the data collaboration, things like that. And the fact that one thing we've also kind of stressed this year is the fact that more of a collaborative effort with everybody involved, not just the school planning team, also working with our administrators as well, our communication team as well, and just making sure, even as she said, with our elected officials and everybody else, so we can really approach this as a team effort, and that way we can come to better solutions for the situation that we have. Mr. Rogers can go into a little bit more detail.
Sure, thanks, Scott. Tim Rogers, Office of School Planning.
Sorry, guys. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning. I'll get it right at some point. Tim Rogers, Office of School Planning. In terms of the options presented in the feasibility study, they begin on page 40 with high school option number 1. And what we did this year is present 2 different alternatives for high schools. The first one would reassign approximately 2,500 high school students, and these are all projected 2020 enrollment numbers. So approximately 2,500 high school students. This option would touch all high schools in the county, and would also have accompanying middle school moves at several middle schools just to line up feeds for the most part. The idea behind both of these options is, I think it's pretty well documented that the high schools in the eastern part of the county have crowding issues, and the high schools in the western part of the county are the ones that have the available capacity. So in terms of those that we're trying to move students from, we're talking about Howard, Long Reach, Mount Hebron, Centennial, and Hammond. And then the schools that have the capacity to relieve those, we're looking at Marius Ridge, River Hill, and Glenelg for the most part, with some capacity also available at Wild Lake. So this first option would move more students, provide more relief long-term for those schools that are overcrowded, and with the middle school moves, again, approximately 2,500 students. The second option would move about 1,000 students less. Again, accompanying middle school moves would move a few more students. Some of those would also be moved at the high school level. We're talking about approximately 1,500 projected students at the high school level and approximately 170 at the middle school level. This option is a little bit lighter in terms of move impact. It does leave the high schools in the eastern part of the county with a little more crowding. That is the area that High School 13 would potentially impact in 2023 in terms of its boundary. And then also leaves the western high schools at what could be perceived as a little more sustainable utilization rate going forward. Moving then to the elementary school plans and options, what we proposed, or what we're presenting here, basically touches 3 different areas of the county, starting with the western elementary schools, projected crowding at West Friendship and Waverly Elementary School necessitates relief to the western schools to the west of there. So mainly the school in this region that has available capacity is Bushy Park. So what we did here was present 3 different options to access that capacity to relieve Waverly and West Friendship. The first option would move approximately 350 students, sort of a domino effect through, the first option is moving a portion of Turf Valley, which still has a significant amount of projected development, to Bushy Park. And what this does is avoid the cascade, the domino effect moves that that are present in other plans. One of the side benefits of this plan is it may allow some relief to St. John's Lane Elementary, which is also projected to be overcrowded using Waverly. This option does not have accompanying middle school moves, but that could be explored by the attendance area committee and the superintendent going forward. The second option is what I started to talk about before, the more of a cascade or domino effect move where neighborhoods are reassigned from Triadelphia Ridge and West Friendship over to Bushy Park in order to enable those schools to provide relief to Waverly and also to West Friendship. This option does also have some relief at St. John's Lane, but in addition to the 500 projected elementary students, nearly 100 projected middle school students would also need to be reassigned to adjust the feeds. Third option for this level is a little bit simpler version of the second one, where it's a smaller cascade, and it would reassign approximately, also accessing capacity at Bushy Park Elementary School, and to relieve Bushy Park. So moving on to the next region in the southwest, we're looking there at relieving projected crowding at Pointers Run Elementary School. The difference in these options is the school that has available capacity actually is adjacent to Pointers Run, and that's Clarksville Elementary. The previous, in the other region, the western region, we have to kind of go through other schools to relieve the ones that are crowded and access the capacity. So option number one in the southwest simply would reassign 3 polygons totaling approximately 150 elementary students to Clarksville from Pointers Run. These include one neighborhood which is under development and several that are already developed on the southeastern edge of the Pointers Run community, just north of 32. So this option would leave Pointers Run within our target utilization of 90 to 110 while not pushing Clarksville over target until the out years, later years. The second option would be a larger plan, a larger option, possibly reassigning up to 300 elementary students, and would also include a middle school reassignment of approximately 20 students. This one, in addition to accessing some capacity at Clarksville, would also access the capacity at Bushy Park. So one of the compromises for this option would be the inability of Bushy Park to provide needed relief to the western schools that were outlined in the first 2 options. And then the third option is a smaller version of the first one, where only one of the 3 neighborhoods proposed in the first option would be reassigned, and the trade-off for moving fewer students, obviously, is less relief for the overcrowded school at Pointers Run. Moving on to the next set of options for elementary school, we're looking at Western Columbia and the projected crowding at Bryant Woods. This region has seen some investment in terms of adding seats in recent years with additions at Swansfield, Running Brook, and Longfellow. So using that some of that capacity, moving approximately 285 students at the elementary level and 50 at the middle level in this first option would bring, so sending students from Bryant Woods to Longfellow and then Longfellow to Swansfield with some additional reassignments between Clemens Crossing, Bryant Woods, and Swansfield would bring these schools within target in the long term. And associated middle school moves are needed as well there to balance the feeds. The second option is a scaled back version of the first one, reassigning approximately 260 students at the elementary level and 100 at the middle level. Some of the neighborhoods proposed in this option are the same. It just has a little bit less impact on relieving Bryant Woods, Clemens Crossing, and would leave Swansfield a little bit less utilized while still within target.
Can you tell us
Sure.
what page you're on?
Oh, sure. I'm
having a hard time.
yeah, sorry. I'm trying to go through quickly to allow you plenty of time for questions. But we're the second option for Columbia is page 124.
Thank you.
Sure. So then as we move forward then, from there we can skip to page 137, which would be the third option for Columbia. And this is the smallest of the 3, reassigning only approximately 180 projected students. And it just focuses in on relieving Bryant Woods to Swansfield, to Longfellow, and then Longfellow to Swansfield. So in all 3 of these scenarios, Longfellow Elementary both send students to Swansfield while receiving students from Bryant Woods. And one of the nice things about these areas is many of the students could walk to multiple elementary schools, so there's a possibility of reassigning walkers from one school to walk to a different school. However, one of the complicating factors for this region is the schools that have the crowding issues are assigned to Wild Lake Middle, while the schools with capacity are assigned to Harper's Choice. So there almost always is a need for accompanying middle school moves to make sure we don't create any new small feeds. So the approach for all these options is to give give choices to the community, show that there are many ways to relieve overcrowding at these schools. And as we go forward, there'll be many combinations and different options proposed. But that's a summary of the ones that we have presented in the feasibility study.
So I wanted to make sure the county was aware that we do have a copy of Policy 6010 at the back of our book. On page 157, it gives the following factors that we can look at when we're considering boundary changes. So it's not just based on capacity that we need to consider those boundary realignments. So the first one has to do with facility utilization, the use of available space, long-range enrollment, fiscal responsibility, the number of walkers, and regional programs. The second one has to do with community stability, keeping students together, contiguous communities, frequency with which any one student is reassigned, demographic, and then the third one has to do with demographic characteristics of student populations, racial, ethnic composition, socioeconomic composition, academic performance of students, level of English learners, number of students moved, and other. And we just talked about equity earlier, and equity could be considered as we look at changing boundaries. It is one of the factors that we could look at. And if you would to go to page 49 for option 1, and it does give us some of the farms level data and test percentages for this one example for our high schools and middle schools. Other ones are throughout this document, also looking at elementary school in terms of farms and test scores. And we have requested that we get for the schools the projected, not only the base level of, say, farms or test scores, but for farms particularly, the proposed level of farms if there was a change, if this option was taken, would it change? And so that's something that we need to see, because what I've been hearing, and I haven't done all of the data, is that we do have schools right next to each other that may be of high farms rate, and a school that doesn't have a high farms rate, and there's not being a change between those schools. And we want to have that data in front of us as we consider that option. But since we talked about equity, I just wanted to bring that to your attention. I must also mention that at our equity work session, we did have a report from our general counsel, Mr. Blum, shared with us that in his research that school districts have been able to change boundaries based on the impact of socioeconomics and matching for that, and that's been more readily accepted by courts as opposed to doing it for racial indicators. So I just want to share that with the county.
Well, so I actually printed off, I guess, page 34, and then I've been taking page 34 and comparing it to each option, because page 34 has all the current base farm data, though it is. I'm glad that it's in here, because I know in previous studies it wasn't. Exactly. So I really appreciate that you guys have taken the step to put it in. And there are some concerning things. I mean, Howard High School it changes a little, but then Oakland Mills goes up in terms of farm, and I guess that when you guys made the motions in January, I had hopes or thoughts that it would be a real focused rebalancing, essentially. I mean, the schools are where they are. The homes are where they are. We know these things. We have increased, our APFO is slowing things down. We talked recently about rollovers and changing how those function in the code to allow school planning to have a better handle on what's coming your way. But I guess I was hoping for something more ambitious and more aligned with the strategic call to action and with actions of equity. And I don't know if that's what this first draft is. But it's especially in light of equity, and I think it's an important conversation that we should be having. And then the other question I had is sort of how high school 13 moves will be affected later. But I guess we'll start with the big one.
So one of the things that I would hope you, that we could illuminate for you is that this was presented to us, and part of the conversation we're then having with Dr. Martirano and the Office of School Planning and operations in general is, where do our priorities lie?
Right. Like, is it
And-
capacity or is it capacity and equity?
And we have really put a lot of effort in it. Like, I sat on the policy committee 2 years ago when we were drafting and revising, and that's where we were able to embed all of those social demographics in the policy 2.5 years ago. So now it's just coming to fruition and reminding that our priorities as a board are, let's follow the policy and really implement those to the best of our ability. And I think we've been able to communicate that to the administration, but it has to happen in tandem with this report. Because one of the things that the policy does indicate is that it's supposed to be a balance. You can't just do capacity utilization, and you cannot just do demographics. And because the schools are where they are and people live where they do. So it has, I think, been made clear by this board where our priorities lie. And so I suspect there'll be some changes that you see to maximize a balance across those considerations.
Right. I think it's just, I know that nobody was in these seats when this sort of issue started. The previous boards have sort of abdicated their responsibility of balancing capacity because they don't want to upset the community. Or they have intentionally made moves and choices that have concentrated students. So I guess why not just rip up the map? And like, why do piecemeal moves versus just a whole new map?
So let me provide some context. I think the best thing is let's understand the length of this process.
Right.
This will end at Thanksgiving.
Right, November 18th.
And how long that is. So when you think about it in the process, here we are in June, and this continues through Thanksgiving.
Right.
And then we start the budget in December. So that's just give you a context.
No.
for
We start the
future.
budget in July. We start the budget in July.
Just want to provide some context to the thoughtfulness. We start the engine with all these variables in a very thoughtful way. And I think what Ms. Mallow just talked about is the development of that policy. We've done a lot of socialization with bringing legal on board because these are issues that are challenged and have to be done thoughtfully. The whole conversation regarding economically disadvantaged students, we are grounded in the law to do that. And so we provided that socialization. We're providing a starting point, and my expectation is there will be lots of input that will effectuate change, and this will not be the end-all, be-all. And so we want to provide to the community the level of openness so that this is, the challenge right now is the plan is what it is, this is what the board's going to adopt, and that is not true. This is a fluid process with a starting point based upon certain variables that all of those things that we've talked about today will be happening. And I'm thrilled that those conversations are happening, quite frankly. There's a local school system right now in Virginia that they just adopted their plan, and great consternation around these topics where there was going to be perceived inequities based upon those. We need to grapple with those, and we need to address a plan that will address those for us. So please understand that this is a fluid process with many opportunities for input and adjustment as we go.
And
Sir,
I think
ma'am.
we have to mention that the process has changed this time around. The AAC is not going to come up with their own plan.
Correct.
They are meeting, and they will provide advice and recommendations to
Correct.
the superintendent, and then he will incorporate that
Mm-hmm.
and bring to the board in August his proposal.
So I want to add some points there. I would say
Do
capacity.
Mr. Wu, and then
Oh,
I
yeah.
think Mr. Washington, Mr. Jones.
Okay. So this is Dr. Tao, Board of Education board member. I want to add several points. So redistricting and farm students, or try to balance farm students, definitely both of concern. I think the highest is the capacity, because if we're not put a capacity at the front line, so people will also say, okay, there's a capacity somewhere. And actually, that's sometimes just a talking point. And in the even west part, we're being overcrowded very soon. In 2 years, a lot of capacity will be filled very soon. I just want to make our council member remember that. And then the development is highly correlated with the school capacity. And we're not able to really sweeten every student out of a crowded school. Our school is out of capacity. I want to make sure everybody understands that. And we need to have our planned and controlled development. Otherwise, we are not able to catch up with the development we're having right now. And I think probably council members heard about that a lot. The last point I want to make, our farm students sometimes doing very good, better than non-farm students in some schools. For example, Reservoir High School, Mount Hebron High School. For certain student populations, their farm students actually doing better, have a higher graduate rate than non-farm students. I just looked at the report recently, and it's a confidential report. But look at that, I think we need to find a way to really how to help our students in different ways, not just focus on redistricting or capacity, or just say, okay, we look at average out students. And so there are many different ways to help, and we need to figure out how to really coordinate the effort and make sure the effort will see the results.
So,
Actually, pretty much, I think they've kind of echoed the points I was going to kind of make. I just want to really just emphasize once again the whole point about this really being the baseline, and that this is just the baseline report. As we said, our AAC meetings just started last week. We have 4 of them. And Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, then we have 4 input meetings right behind that. So pretty much there will be community input even before the superintendent makes his recommendation in August, and then all the public hearings start. It's about a 5 to 6 month process, but you have to have your baseline showing where you are, and there's some potentials before we can actually assess what's the best priorities in which to move. And as the board makes their priorities more clear with that process, you'll begin to see those concerns you were concerned about being addressed.
Yes. So, Dr. Wu, I agree with you somewhat that capacity is the biggest issue, because numbers-wise it is. But we must look at if what Madam Chair mentioned, trying to coagulate the two with respect to just starting over with the map versus what's happening now. We can look at all these things along with capacity. So I don't want it to be a situation where capacity is number one, but other things can be looked at maybe, or if it's convenient, let's just bring it all together. And I think that's what's happening. And if this is a baseline, I'm ecstatic about it. I think that capacity is the number one, but the other number 2, number 3, they're so close to being number one that you might as well just look at it all. And I think so I agree with you somewhat. And then I also want to push back on one thing with respect to development and overcrowding. Being a numbers person, it is probably safe to say that there's a correlation between development and overcrowding, but I haven't seen any numbers on that. So before I can agree with that statement, I just want to see that. It's probably safe to say that. Just thinking about it makes sense, but I would want to actually see that data. And then the third thing is, before I can say that, and then the third thing I want to ask is with respect to the options. Are these options independent of each other? For instance, the high school option, the Columbia option, or are they all taken together in categories? So, for instance, all of the Columbia options and the high school options, are those together? Are they independent? And the reason I ask that is because I live in Elk Ridge, and my kids are zoned for Columbia schools. But if we're still living there in 10 years, we may be at high school 13, or maybe 14, or whatever happens in 10 years, right? So my question is, what about those plans? So I just want to get all my questions out before I don't get the microphone again.
So where do we begin trying to keep track of all of those? Let's start with the latter regarding the fact of how those different plans were presented and developed. What we're trying to do is provide an incredible amount of flexibility to the board to pick and choose, and then the continuity and the contiguous issues associated with that. And again, for bringing the science components back into this, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, and we have to be very thoughtful as we make those moves. But we spent an incredible amount of time developing these options to give choices to our board and then address the issues that are most salient in this discussion. So capacity is a driver, but this brings front and center the conversations about equity. And so let me continue to address those as you were discussing. So for us to miss that opportunity when we're talking about equity at the levels at which we are is absolutely, for me, a level of malpractice. In terms of as we're approaching it. That's how serious we're looking at it. We've got the issues of capacity combined with the issues of equity. And so let me just give you some salient points. Ms. Taj and I have had great conversations about this as well as other board members and how this plays out and why this is critical. In the schools where we have greater needs, when we talk about this, teachers are buying supplies, more so readily in terms of scaffolding for their young people. The issues in terms of PTA involvement. I mean, again, we're talking about haves and have-nots. The boosters. Again, how that plays out in regards to conversations about equity. Ms. Ellis and I have had great conversation about how we accept donations, again, from the conversations of schools that are more affluent versus ones that aren't, and how do we provide that level of equalization by saying these are our needs partners, these are our needs for our schools, and providing that support. Again, the greater needs of our students and what we need to do to provide those supports. And one that's got me extremely ramped up, why we would have these conversations is if you accept the premise, and the research supports this, that the main issue in terms of effectuating change for academic achievement is teacher quality. So having the very best teacher in front of our children every day. Well, our system is set up in a way when we go and we diversify our workforce, it's usually last one in, first one out. That's the conversation internally. So if there's an adjustment in enrollment and that is reduced, last one in, first one out, after we've made opportunities to address the diversification. And we look at the level of experience where the process of transfers, our schools that have greater need have less experienced teachers just based upon years of service. So we have to, we're really confronting, again, the data pieces of this as it plays out in the boundary adjustments. So again, yes, capacity is a driver, but we've developed, as Ms. Mallow said, with intentionality, a policy that allows us to look at those other factors of equity and socioeconomic and have now the socialization of the legal support to advance on that level. So I'm very proud of this board. I must say publicly, I'm very proud of the Board of Education for being very courageous in taking these conversations on when a lot of people won't do that. So I'm very happy and proud to be working with a board that's taking those courageous stances to do so within the bounds of the policy.
So can I have a question to Mr. Washington? So Mr. Washington, can you say to the board and the county council, if we do redistricting to try to ease the overcrowding in many schools, like in 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, will be overcrowded again? Where's the number?
Oh my gosh, Ashley.
Fastest growing county in the state.
Yeah, I agree. So yeah, pretty much. If you look at the fact that for the most part, I think Tim this year was a 776.
That's what we're projecting.
Okay, and last year was like 850.
Yeah.
So it's consistently between 750 and 1,000 kids pretty much a year. The number that's over our school system as in general. So that's our 74 comprehensive schools. How do you feel about the numbers, Tim? I think that may be a correct statement.
Yeah, I'd agree with what you said, Scott. I think we're projecting, we've historically grown 750 to 1,000 students, and we're projecting that to continue.
Okay.
I think that goes along with the question that Dr. Wu, you asked. maybe a few weeks ago, do we get rid of portables due to the fact that we are going into a boundary review adjustment, and we said no.
But will the new
to-
APFO slow down
We'll
the
keep
growth?
them.
Well,
for you?
just to illuminate that a little bit more. So your average elementary school, our newest elementary schools are being brought online in the, I believe, the 600 to 680 range of number of students. The middle schools are about the same, and a high school is seated at capacity of 1,600 approximately.
1650.
1650. So when you're looking at the part that connects back to you, which is the capital budget, we need to build a school a year. And until we're building a school a year to handle 1,000 students a year, we are going to remain over capacity. We're going to equalize capacity now, and then we'll quickly be over capacity. And until the capital budget allows us to build corresponding numbers of schools, our reliance on portables is going to continue and increase.
But you can't say it's a school a year
No.
because you're not getting 1,000 students in
Right.
one catchment area.
But-
It's 1,000 students over
Right. I think-
dozens and dozens of schools.
On average,
Yeah.
it's a school year.
Right.
But renovations and additions and that report
think
was
you-
very
yeah.
helpful, David, by the way.
That's.
But
that's,
I'm saying,
And I'm not
in
saying that-
equivalency. It's just to give it
I
kind
know,
of.
but I think it's false for people at home hearing it. They're going to hear, oh, we need to build a school a year, but there's no financial way to do that. There is no thoughtful way to do it, and there's no way in reality to do that because you're not getting 1,000 students in one spot.
Right.
You know, we're not, well,
But-
downtown Columbia. Well,
but-
but no, you wouldn't even be getting students in downtown Columbia because you're not projecting students.
We don't
You're-
know.
You got units.
We don't know.
But we've talked about earlier, was this week? No, it was last week. It's today Monday?
Yes, today's
Yes.
Monday, last Friday.
I don't even know. So I guess it was last week, we talked about fixing the rollover issues to allow for better school planning. We have APFO, the new APFO coming in, which will help slow the growth. There's a whole trio of bills that we've discussed just this legislative month that will help produce, that will allow for better planning. But because, I mean, you look at some of these, some of the capacities, and some of that is because there's turnover in established communities.
Absolutely.
You know, like
Right.
that's, if we look at some of the older Columbia schools, they're not getting more development. And Cradle Rock, I think, was the example of it, right?
They're not getting more development, but I think this is
Yeah.
what gets back to the bigger
Bryant
issue.
Woods, yeah.
Demographics drive capacity. That would be my little saying. Demographics drive capacity. If you have a school with high-scoring kids, everybody wants to move there. When people come to Howard County, many of them come because of the school district. We all know that. How many times do we say that during our campaigns for county council and during our campaigns for school board? This is our crown jewel. And what do people look at when they move to Howard County? Unfortunately, what they look at is the average score of the kids who go to that school.
Well, they look at greatschools.com.
Or they look at or they look at a website that doesn't really understand the nature of our schools. That is why this drives capacity. So the schools that have the higher scores or have great schools ratings, those parents want to move to those communities. And it ends up overcrowding those schools. And then the schools that don't have the greater scores or that don't have the greatest reviews on great schools, those schools end up having more capacity. Or if you're out west,
That's
you just-
actually not
you
what
don't
we're
have-
seeing at all.
Actually,
that is actually what I'm
The
seeing.
destination schools are unfortunately the ones that still have capacity, and we can't figure out, because of zoning changes, how to get people there,
Well,
where we
I
have a
was just
lot of
gonna say,
overcrowded
except in the
schools.
west, where you don't
Well,
have.
even in,
you don't
like,
have the
Centennial and
ability
stuff.
to. Centennial's way overcrowded.
Well, but
Centennial's is
not
like
overcrowded.
130% capacity.
But-
I mean, so, yeah. I
Well,
mean,
we're
that's
overcrowd-
one issue. And I think that the other issue is we're looking at the schools, if you look at the schools that have these biggest needs, you'll notice, for example, there are 2 middle schools with huge, this gets back to looking at all of the demographics of the schools that are feeding in. 3 Wild Lake moms here, 2 Harper's Choice moms, and a Wild Lake Middle School mom. I mean, we can see this list and where all those middle schools feed into a high school that then creates a really high farms rate. And we've just got to do some more balancing for some of these schools so that we're not dealing with all of the demographic issues in a handful of schools, 2 or 3 schools. I mean, it's pretty apparent when you look at these lists, what's going on and where we really need to concentrate and focus, when it comes to trying to balance some of this situation.
And it becomes cyclical. I mean, you almost end up
That's
in
what
a
I
death
said.
spiral that,
Becomes cyclical.
and
Yes.
and as a realtor, I can tell you, I mean, greatschools.com is single-handedly resegregating our schools and
Which
resegregating
is
our
a
communities.
darn shame.
Well, I think
Because-
it's.
Because people don't have the,
But
I'll
that was
say to
lightly
people,
said,
go visit the
actually.
schools. I can introduce you to some parents. And the
Correct.
reality is, you're moving to a new area. You've already got kids. You don't have time to do all that. So they just say, look, I want an 8 or a 9. Move me there. And it's so the folks that aren't moving there are the ones that maybe can't quite afford it, or they're not as focused on that being their primary driver to where they go. And it's
I think we're
It
going to
gets-
continue to have
yeah.
this issue as long as we use standardized test scores as a measure of achievement.
Vicki,
And that
I
is-
couldn't agree with you more. It really
You take
it-
away
it
socioeconomic
changed
status
so
and their
much.
schools even up.
Yeah.
And as long as we continue to use
Yep.
standardized tests,
And all the public reporting
that's
of it.
talking about
Yeah.
root cause analysis,
and
and then
I-
it's a bad cycle.
And
Then how can we move away
threw
from
out, the problem, like if you really get into Maryland Report Card, you can really build the case that your particular kid, whatever their demographic, socioeconomic situation is going to do pretty much the same across the system. But that's not a user-friendly website.
No,
It's
it's
a
not.
data dive for every.
It is very
Nobody's going to dig into
Well, I
that.
think students that are from a lower socioeconomic status won't do as well at every school, and that is the problem. My kid, it wouldn't matter. We had the resources to provide and that sort of thing, and that's
Right.
I think what we're discussing is that the impact on poor students at poor schools is significant, and students of wealth at poor schools will do better.
Do just
The-
fine.
the
Well,
I just
data
wish we had
shows.
some
Yeah.
other model.
Yes.
So about
My industry had some other model to be able to hand people that want to take a quick snapshot that wasn't great schools.
I have
here's a-
something for you.
There's actually, it's a report called Equitable Report Cards in June 2019, and it adjusts providing high-poverty schools with an opportunity to be recognized for the value they add to high-need student populations. And I can send you this report.
That'd
You
be
click
great.
here for a list of all Maryland schools, and you can segregate it by elementary, middle, or high. And it re-aggregates that ESSA rating with stars and allows you to accommodate for poverty, and really, it shows a dramatic change in how great some of our schools really are.
Is this that 5-star system that the state has gone to?
It's
No?
a re-aggregation of that
Okay, good.
5-star system, and but I'll share it with the whole of the county council and particularly I was going to bring this up and say, let's get this kind of information out into our community, because some of our schools with the lowest star rating, like Swansfield, are amazing schools.
Well, and that's the thing. If you
So-
tore up the map and you redid it, but you still didn't perfectly equalize every school, you would just start this process over again because people are still gonna
I think it'd be
shop.
marginal. There'll be people who will do that. So that's why I say let's raise the transfer tax and then redistrict.
Well, the state is also
And then
going
let
to
the
use,
people pay
sorry.
the tax for those choices. But to Dr. Wu's point and to your point, I mean, to me, a great school would be students are here, thanks to the interventions of teachers, principals, and everyone there, their test scores have moved here versus, we have, how are you measuring the improvement of each student versus, students who start wealthy and end wealthy?
And Dr. Martirano, while you're answering that,
Hold
can
on,
you
you
also?
just- you were just talking about achievement, and then you switched over to wealthy and not wealthy.
Well, if you look at
And I-
those test scores and look at them with wealth, we all know what they actually measure. But I guess I think I just set us down a diversion away from the
Yeah.
feasibility study because we only
Can you
have.
also address your, can you expand on your statement where you said the less experienced teachers are at the schools, the poorer schools?
Yeah, so let me, we're getting down to the end, and I wanted to say something that kind of pulls all this together in terms of the philosophy that I've shared with many of you individually. The philosophy of the school system is to basically close the gap while raising the bar for all individuals. So that is our philosophy, looking at everything with a level of intentionality and breaking down those barriers for allow that to occur. So during these discussions, I mean, these are going to be robust discussions. And again, it's very heartwarming to know at least we're talking about them as a way to effectuate that change. But it's a long process, it's a convoluted process, there's opportunities for us to review as well as the board and the community to engage. But I want to caution us on one other thing too. It's reality versus perception. Our schools, if you take a look at our schools, are some of the finest. And I can give you qualitative, I can give you quantitative. I can give you comparative lists, how we rank regarding other county schools. Our schools are always in the top of all of those, all of our high schools, all of our middle schools, and all of our elementary schools. So it's these conversations that cause me great consternation because as superintendent of this school district, any school of which you choose to put your child in, you're going to get a top-notch education. You just are. And that's embedded in our values, that's embedded in our budget, our decision-making, and conversations like this. So for individuals to say and pit one school against another, that is wrong. That is absolutely wrong. But those conversations occur on a regular basis. And so we're talking about our babies, our children, and our kids are listening to these conversations. I want you to know that. We've had conversations now where we are having children engaging in student exchange programs. They're aware of the conversations that are said about their schools. We need to be real careful. I'm not lecturing this crowd, but our community, because kids are listening and they're acutely aware of it. So systems of which we have in place, you've asked me to address the concern. When we hire teachers, we place teachers based upon where we have our needs and our vacancies. But then also we have a process that when we have to surplus or whether there's enrollment shifts, et cetera, and then teachers have their own voluntary moves of which they can make. Individuals are making decisions to leave schools at times that have greater challenges. And so where we have our greater needs, we want our very best teachers. So we're trying to make adjustments regarding that process. And then to ways of which we can have conversations down the road about incentivizing a variety of things. But I do need to be aware, I want to say that final piece, my focus is on providing the very best teacher for all of our children in that classroom every day and making sure that systems remain in place where we can have that retention level as well as recruit.
So I want to add 3 points. So,
Chad, can I just respond to that really quick before, or is it related to what?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I think the county council and
So
the
just to
school-
wrap up, we'll have Dr. Wu,
Okay.
Ms. Taj,
Sure.
and then we'll close up.
Okay. So the county council and the school definitely can work together on many issues. For example, if you look at the farm rate at the elementary school and high school, for high school, there's not so much huge difference. But for elementary school, there's a huge difference at different elementary school, the farm rate, right? So the reason for that, one reason, because the elementary school is too small, and they only have like 300, 400, even 600. But for high school, they cover a much larger area. So that actually balances out the population. And then that come back to the county council planning. So for example, Hoco Ridge Village Center, right? We are trying to put a high density house in there. How does that play out eventually in terms of the farm rate, in terms of student population? I think the county council need to realize that will impact school, right? So the old Columbia Village revitalization, so we think about several village centers to be redeveloped. How will that play out in the school student population? How will that play out in the redistricting? That will impact our school system. Then talk about the tax. So the transfer tax definitely one way to help the school and help the whole county government. But the impact fee is another way to raise some fees, right? So just
we're definitely
Sure.
we're already on the impact fee.
Yeah.
I was simply saying the transfer tax. If there are people who wish to move schools, I think we've talked. The transfer tax goes into the red in a few years
Sure.
anyway. So I would rather I think, we need to deal with the transfer tax now. Mr. Youngman's made great points about maybe we need to think about how that sort of pie of that is sliced and diced, because maybe there's different priorities in different years. But it's not, there's no panacea,
Sure.
right? It's going to take impact fees, school surcharges, however you want to call them, as long as they affect the entire district and not regional. It's going to take transfer tax, and it's going to take really looking at what our schools need. If we want to do community schools, what's that funding look like? If we increase transportation, what does that look like? What does it look like if we increase workforce development? And how do we do it tied to parents and community schools? So, yes, but I just wanted to make sure you knew that we are looking at every angle.
Sure. Thank you.
Can I ask one question about redistricting? I hear a lot of people, they talk about the suddenness of it. The suddenness of it. You're in the same community, same school for.
process of it?
Like.
Just saying.
Have we ever talked about a model where, and I think it's particularly hard in high school, have we ever talked about a model where, you do a big redistricting of a high school, but, the kids that are there can matriculate out. It's the incoming ninth graders that then get redistricted.
Right.
I believe we did this in the 80s. I was at Mount Hebron when Centennial, and remember Dunlogan was back and forth over a period of time. So you had siblings that went to two different high schools. So, the family certainly could agree to go to the new school. But if you had a rising 11th grader, they could choose to stay there. And if we do long-term planning well enough, you should be able to pull that trigger a year or two earlier where you don't need that immediate fix.
Right.
Our policy dictates regarding rising sieves, certain grade levels, et cetera. And I think I understand what you're saying. Do you have anything else you want to say?
I was going to say that just sounded like an option, or some of the things we considered last year when we were talking about all the different models, or maybe 2 years ago when we were talking about a lot of different models for redistricting. That's what it sounds like. It could be something that the board can consider when it's that time. For,
you wouldn't get that
an option.
more immediate fix. It would take you a couple years
slow
to.
phase-in, yeah.
And if you even dropped it into
predictability
the.
of projections could also be affected
Yeah.
by that. That could make planning a little more difficult.
It's probably going to make it more difficult, yeah.
If the board is looking.
But I have
Who was staying.
But still, and
the
also.
school, you're close though, right? You had an error rate of 0.2%. I mean, that's kind of impressive.
But still, it also goes back to another issue I think Ms. Mallow alluded to earlier. Again, it also depends on how the projections are wonderful, but it still ties into your capital budget. How is that changed each year? Is it consistent? Is it funded? Or are there priorities that have to change because we've had shortfalls in the budget? If the projects that are there don't move forward and those things don't happen, then your planning is going to change consistently because you don't have that. But I just wanted to piggyback on, because actually one thing Ms. Mal also said when we talk about the whole thing about the capacity numbers and things like that, it is localized. And I think one of the things we discussed last time we were actually here together, and the feasibility study actually kind of shows this, is some of what we're trying to do capital-wise was some of the systemic projects that had gotten pushed out. We looked at trying to bring them in and putting the localized additions on those, such as the Oakland Mills, such as the Patapsco Middles. We listened, like I said, but my point is, the thing is that, again, still goes back to, again, capital dollars. The planning that they do consistently, we have a long-range plan that goes in, it shows 10 years every single year. But at the same time, based off of what money you get and do not get, it gets modified every single year. And as the demands change, the finances have got to be there. So if the finances are not there and the capital budgets do not happen, the projects don't happen, we can plan and we can project, but you're not going to have the place for them to go because you got to have the money to build the schools or the additions necessary to make sure we take care of that.
And keep in mind, starting in 2021, we're going to be deficient at every level, and it just keeps getting worse and worse. And as I mentioned the other night during the hearing, that in 23-24, the seats available we'll have at high school will be a negative 328. And remember, that includes the 200 Hammond addition, as well as high school 13. So unfortunately, that window of redistricting ourselves out of this is closing quickly.
Come back to the.
All right, Ms. Taj, let's have you wrap up. You'll be the last.
10 minutes ago.
Yes, we don't want to leave you, you're hanging there, so.
All right.
All right, Ms. Taj, you get the last word.
All right. I just want to go back to your comment about having the least experienced and least qualified teachers in the higher farm schools. So when we talk about Title I funding or differentiated staffing, and you talk about funding per school, per building, it doesn't look very different, even given differentiated staff and even giving Title I funds. You're still looking at the least experienced staff in those buildings, and you're not looking at anything above what anyone else has in terms of money. So it's even, do you understand? Yeah. Okay. So teachers, 84% of the budget is staff, right?
Right.
And then if you look at what you pay a teacher for 10 years of teaching versus what you pay a teacher for 2 years of teaching, it's markedly different. Now, if you look at higher farm schools, you're seeing the least experienced teachers in those schools. So your 84% of that budget is smaller in those schools than in lower farm schools. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, thank you.
And so you have a lot of lower paid people in the Title I schools or in the high farm school. And we know that student achievement or closing the gap is correlated with having highly qualified, very experienced teachers. So we're not providing that resource in those schools. And then I just wanted to go back to standardized testing. I think we need to be careful to talk about eliminating standardized testing, nationally normed data, because otherwise there's no way to measure achievement gap or opportunity gap. And so we have to be careful about how we do that and how we take away data to not be able to close the gap and not be able to measure how we're closing the gap.
Thank you, Ms. Taj. I mean, I mostly just want to take away greatschools.com.
Yeah. Yes,
Really,
and we should come up with a way to
what
do
I
that.
want to take away. But yeah.
Nationwide, I like that idea.
I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to come together and discuss these really important issues. It's really a wonderful opportunity that both the new council and the new board are coming together to do. So thank you so much, and we look forward to continuing these conversations.
Do we get a day off?
Thank you.
Now. You can on Friday. You get the next day off on Friday. That's okay.